Hello, I'm Henry Shelford, Chairperson of SarcoidosisUK, and absolutely thrilled and very excited to have Dr. Anna Blakney with us, Assistant Professor at the University of British Columbia and a specialist in RNA vaccines, which are clearly absolutely the most important thing of the moment. Welcome, Anna, and thank you again.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Now, people may remember Anna, who's kindly participated in another video previously, also on vaccines, teaching us about them, and particularly RNA vaccines. We've had a lot of questions keeping coming in, I think particularly because Anna's in British Columbia in Canada, but in the UK, people who are on the shielding list have started to get letters, and so that's suddenly crystallised for people that decision that they've been called to come and get the vaccine. I thought we've got lots of questions sent in. As ever, if you people please comment them in. We're live on YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram and Facebook, and we have someone looking at them all, but particularly Twitter and Facebook. So if you've got a question, post it and we'll try and answer them. Now, this session is particularly about the vaccine technology, which Anna is an absolute specialist. We are having some sessions on sarcoidosis and the vaccine coming up. We're looking to have 2 of those. We're scheduling them right now, but we're expecting one possibly within 1 to 2 weeks and the other in 3 to 4 weeks. So those are coming up. I'm going to attempt to answer some of the questions because we've answered them before, but this is not that session. We're very lucky to have Anna really talk us through the technology, and that's this session. I thought we were talking just before, Anna. We said I thought we'd start off with some of the things you've talked about online, because they are some of the main message points. So if we cut now to this is, I think, your most recent tweet. Mm-hmm. Do you want to just talk us through why you've tweeted that out and why you were why you've done this, why you're on the podcast?
Yeah, so I've been on a number of podcasts recently, and these are really just people wondering what I'm doing on TikTok, and so yeah, I mean, really the whole point is that I'm really passionate about science and vaccines, and also educating people about these topics, and of course this is especially important right now. So I'm actually a part of Team Halo, which is a collaboration between the UN and the Vaccine Confidence Project, with the goal of connecting scientists and clinicians who work on COVID-19 to the general public. So that's how I got started on TikTok. But in general, I think I've experienced this through this pandemic, and just from talking to people, is that I my general approach is to be really open and honest about the data that we do have and what it means and what conclusions we can have, as well as just explaining these vaccine technologies, hopefully in a way that makes it so everybody can understand it.
And TikTok has clearly been you've had extraordinary success with TikTok, and that's how you're obviously brilliant already, but TikTok has allowed us to know about you. And yes, you're just over 200,000 followers. Did you crack open a little champagne getting to 200K? That sounds like that is a pretty cool thing. And 2 million likes.
Yeah, I had never imagined that it would get this big, but I think it really speaks to just how much interest there is, in these particular topics at this time, right? And I think TikTok actually is a really great platform for it because, a lot of times science seems really intimidating and unapproachable, but when you're just making 15 or 60-second videos, they can be quite educational, but it's a little tidbit, right? It's just enough where somebody can watch it and understand some part of, the whole system. And so I think it's a really useful platform for being able to show people, what we do in the lab, how we make vaccines, and how we test them.
Talking of which, we've got some of your videos, so we're going to try and try and show some of them. Wish us luck, because I think this is pushing our technological
vaccine yet, but the first thing I ask myself is
ground somewhat. Yeah, okay, wish us all luck.
Is this disease a risk to me? So with COVID, yes, it's everywhere. It's still really prevalent, so I'd like to get a vaccine. The second thing I ask myself are, what are the risks of the vaccine versus what are the risks of the actual disease? I think this decision varies from person to person, but to preface this, I'm 30, I have no underlying health conditions, no allergies, and I'm also of childbearing age, although don't remind my mom of that, she'll get her hopes up. So then I weigh the risks of getting the vaccine versus getting the actual disease. I think the long-term effects of COVID are much more unknown than the long-term effects of the vaccines from what I've read and from what I know. As far as which one I choose, anything that's approved is good enough for me. I've been asked this question a lot, so I thought I would share with you what are my preferences and.
Henry, I could see it, but I'm not sure if the sound came through.
Oh dear, okay, well, we'll give that up. But the sound was fabulous. There's a slight lag with Leo listening to it, so he's the one who reports in, but obviously it's quite quick. Anyway, everyone should go and see it. Anna Blakney on TikTok, and it's fabulous. You've also been on the Science Hour on the BBC World Service talking about the futures of vaccines, COVID and otherwise. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so, I think any opportunity to really talk about these vaccines is really exciting. And, as everybody knows now, the first time that an RNA vaccine was approved was for COVID-19, right? But I think that the technology is really exciting. Obviously, I'm biased because that's what I do my research on. But I think we're going to continue to see also, it really just changed the way that we make other vaccines as well. So one example that I like to give is just, the flu vaccine, which we make every year, it's actually not a great vaccine, right? So in a given year, it's usually 30 to 40% effective. And this is just because flu mutates so rapidly, right? So we actually have a really great network of centers all over the world that are constantly monitoring the flu virus. But we have to decide for the Northern Hemisphere in February of each year when we're what strains we're going to put into the vaccine so that we can produce it in eggs, this really old production method, so that it's ready to go in October when we start administering it to everybody. And so, now that we know that RNA vaccines we can make and scale so rapidly, you could envision, instead of having just one vaccine that we decide in February, potentially, a few different vaccines that we make through the course of the winter in response to those changing flu mutations to hopefully make it even better. So I think there's a lot of opportunities out there for RNA vaccines.
RNA vaccines have saved the day, right? They've come through the fastest. It's a new technology. They don't rely on having a live vaccine in them, which makes them more available and with less issues for people, particularly say if they're immunocompromised. I presume one of the reasons you chose it as an area of specialism is it's an extraordinarily important emerging area. The Pfizer vaccine came out of being used as a treatment for cancer, and it was then rapidly repurposed, that same technology. So I think so presumably you did pick it because you thought this is an exciting area of development that is exploding right now. It happens to be that it's exactly at the right time.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is a really exciting technology, and I think, as you said, so BioNTech originally was working on RNA cancer vaccines, but yeah, I think the applications are pretty endless.
What are you particularly working on right now?
Yeah, so I work on it as more of a platform, right? So with the idea that making the RNA work better as well as the delivery platforms work better, such that you could apply it to any new disease or existing vaccine and just have a better vaccine. So it's not really specific for one indication. The idea is that it's better overall, that it will work, kind of better for all these different diseases as well.
And we're seeing the importance of that right now as we look at treating the different variants of COVID-19. I think that's something that's very important. We've had a report in that TikTok could be heard, so we're okay. I think the sound comes from the computer there, fine. So that was good. So everyone heard your brilliance, and hopefully it's going to go and subscribe. Right, we're on to questions. We've had some sent in. I'm going to do some that have been sent in to us first, and we obviously sent those to you previously. The first ones are just about the letter to Shield, so I'm going to do those. So we've had a question from Emma Jones. I've had a letter to Shield from my GP, but nothing from the NHS, as I'm not undergoing any treatment. Will I be on the vulnerable list? It's generally the GP, well, both are calling. Your GP will have made the decision, and if my understanding is that then you're tagged on the system as shielding, and so the letter can come from either side. Do contact your GP. They're the ones who know, and you can talk to them. They're also maintaining, as a number of them maintain, a last-minute list. So people who say that they can come in quite quickly, and so it may be worth calling them to say also, look, I'm up for being on the last-minute list, and I can be in within however long, and that's a good thing to do too. We've had people asking about their families living with them, and are they also going to be get it at the same time as you? The answer is no. There's been very strict. It's in order of clinical need, and that doesn't. So, for instance, my parents. My father is older. He got called, and 5 days later, my mum got called, and they're both gone, and I am over the moon thrilled about that. Haven't seen them for a very long time, and we've decided, obviously Christmas got nixed, and so we're having Vaximus. That's our plan. Anna, have you been able to see your parents at all, or loved ones?
So I guess I just moved to Vancouver in January, and I was in London beforehand, so I didn't go to, so my family is in Colorado in the States still, so I didn't go to Colorado en route, because just complicated flights and traveling around right now, right? So no, I haven't seen them in a while.
Much as Zoom is wonderful, it's not quite the same. We had to do our nursery has had a COVID case, so they had to not in my son's class. Anyway, we've just tried to do Zoom with 3-year-olds.
Yeah, they do not have the attendance capacity for it.
I mean, I hardly do. It's that did not work. Right, some questions. A bit for the both of us. If we get a choice of vaccination, which would you get? I know you've already answered it in the video, but I think people would like to hear it.
That's a good question, and I can kind of inform as to the differences and how you would choose. I think the main point is, at this point in time, you probably won't have a choice, just because we are supply limited right now, right? So whatever vaccine is available when you're called to go is probably what you're going to end up getting. in a world where, we had unlimited supplies of all of these approved vaccines, I mean, really anything that's approved by the MHRA or these other regulatory bodies is good enough for me. I guess if you really had to decide, obviously if you have the choice between all of them, I would just go for the one with the highest efficacy and the lowest, amount of side effects. So for that, so far as the data shows, are the RNA vaccines. But anything that's approved is good enough for me. I know the rigorous data that they look for and all the checkpoints it has to pass. So passing that approval is they're all good vaccines that make it past that.
Yeah, and the alternative, which I think people need to focus on, the alternative is wandering around and getting it in the wild.
Exactly.
And so, which do you want? And I was trying to think of an analogy. I've failed, Anna. I've absolutely failed. But the nearest I've got is, if you were told you had to go and see a tiger, would you go to a tiger-infested forest and try and hunt it in the wild and possibly get hunted, or would you go to the zoo? Go to the zoo. And it's a terrible analogy. It's the best I could think of. But that difference,
Yeah, I think what you the point of what you're getting at is the relative risk, right? And I think that's really important to consider when you're thinking about getting any vaccine, right? Vaccines do have side effects, and diseases also do have side effects. So I think for me right now, at least thinking about COVID-19 and getting a vaccine, it's okay, sure, the I talked about this in the video as well, but the first and foremost thing is is there a need for me to get it? The answer, I think, for most of the global population is yes at this point in time, unless maybe you live in New Zealand or something like that. There's no cases around, but sure, they're still going to get vaccinated. But it's really the risk of, how bad is the disease going to be versus how bad are the side effects from the vaccine. And for me, the really unnerving thing is just how little we understand about COVID-19 at this point in time and how long those effects can last, right? So we are seeing long-lasting effects on the heart or nervous tissue and lungs that we don't quite understand. And so who knows, how long those could last for and if there's, irreparable damage to your tissues. Whereas for the vaccines, we have better safety data and long-term safety data and a better idea of the side effects in all of these clinical trial participants. And so for me, it's quite obvious that the risk of getting the vaccine is much less than getting COVID-19, even, being a young and healthy individual. So that's kind of how I calculate it for myself.
and I think that's exactly the point. Even if you look at the very basic data, we're now into millions dead from COVID, and for vaccines and people taking the vaccine, the numbers are in the actual tests. I think it was 0. But are you aware of anyone dying? You did a good TikTok on people talking about, well, you were brutal. She was brutal, people. It's talking about some old people dying. Well, tell everyone what you said. It was a story about some people who were in the more aged category, who unfortunately passed quite soon after having the vaccine.
Well, there was kind of this story in the media that all these elderly patients in Norway had gotten the vaccine and then died. And they were trying to say that the vaccine is what caused them to die. So yeah, that TikTok video is a little bit brutal, but it's just reminding people that, yeah, people do die. It's an unfortunate fact of life, right? But just because people died after getting, sometime after getting the vaccine, that doesn't mean it was because of the vaccine, right? And so we can dig into that data and see that, okay, here's the frequency of death in the normal population for people of this age, and here's the frequency of death for those people that received the vaccine. And there was no difference between them, right? So it means, it's correlation versus causality, right? So it wasn't caused by the vaccine. It just happened that they got the vaccine and then died.
Yeah, I think. Yeah,
sorry, I was going to say, but no. So as far as we've seen so far, there aren't vaccine-caused deaths with the COVID-19 vaccine.
Yeah. If you inject all of your oldest people, a chunk are unfortunately going to pass, and it's not to do with the vaccine. It's because they're literally your oldest people who are past. That is their time. And but what we do know is, and unfortunately really do know, is that if that population gets COVID in the wild and they meet the wild tiger, then we know that they do die, and in very, very large numbers. And you talked about the long-term effects, and one of the things that I think is spoken about, and you phrased well about COVID, but it's under-spoken around about flu, is that actually flu also, if people get severe flu as when they're older, it has long-term effects, particularly cardiac effects and other effects, and it's very common to see readmissions and linked to that. And so I think the world has previously, with these kind of more virulent infections, has been quite relaxed about them, and I hope a future hope is that we aren't relaxed about having the flu and infecting Granny. We need to stop doing that. Those people that have my who come into the office going, I'm toughing it out. I'm like, oh, that's great for you. I'm getting that in a couple of days, aren't I? Rather you'd stayed home.
A positive outcome of this pandemic is that we're all, more aware of infectious diseases now and how not to spread them.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing. We've had a message from on Facebook from Sarah. I was fortunate to receive my first dose of the vaccine on Monday, and I have had no issues as yet.
That's great news.
That is good. Yeah, and Melanie, Pfizer first last week, no symptoms. Sarah had my first Oxford A jab on Monday this week, so far, feeling fine. Jill, I've had mine on Friday. I felt a bit poorly over the weekend, and it worried, it had triggered a flare, but I'm feeling much better today. Short-term pain for long-term gain.
Good news all around.
It's and I think it's important. The problem with when people just get on is that they often just sort of get on and don't talk about it. So I wanted to highlight that because actually we very much need to say that. Right, come on, we need to do some of these questions. We've had a couple of questions come in around from Denise and Peter. One is it correct that the different vaccines work in different ways in the cell? And if we get a choice, should we get a choice? Well, you're pro the mRNA, so I think you've answered that one. So, so is it correct that different vaccines work in different ways in the cell?
So yes and no. So, with any vaccine, we're trying to train your immune system to recognize a protein without ever seeing that virus, right? So for SARS-CoV-2, I'm sure you've now heard about the famous spike protein. So that's just the protein that's on the surface of the virus. So that's our target for the vaccine. That's what we're trying to train your immune system to recognize. So there's a number of different ways to do this, right? So, some of the options are to, the old way of making vaccines, where we could just take a live virus and inactivate it, and that would train your body to recognize it. Then, we kind of moved on to making protein vaccines, where we can actually make the proteins in the lab, just the protein, so it's not that whole viral particle, and use that as a vaccine. And then the newest way to do this really is with nucleic acids, right? So RNA vaccines. So instead of making the protein in the lab, which actually takes a lot of time and resources to do because you have to use these huge cell culture vats, we can synthetically make the RNA, and then that just gives your cells the code to make that spike protein. So we're actually kind of using the patient as a bioreactor to manufacture the protein themselves. So all of the vaccines are trying to train your immune system to recognize that protein. They introduce the protein in different ways though. So obviously the RNA vaccines, so that's the Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna vaccines, use RNA to tell your cells to encode the protein, whereas the Oxford and AstraZeneca vaccine is a slightly different approach. So they use what's called a viral vector, which sounds kind of scary. I don't know why we keep referring to it that way, other than, it's the scientific term for it, right? But it's essentially just a repurposed cold. So it's an adenovirus that infects chimpanzees naturally, and not humans. And so they just repurposed that viral packaging, which is really good at getting into cells. And actually that then contains the DNA code to make the same spike protein. So the short answer to your question is they're all trying to train your immune system to recognize the protein. So that's really the mechanism. But yes, they introduce the protein in different ways.
Thank you. And I think it's worth, again, reminding people, like one of the main alternatives is just catching it, and then your body is doing the same, but with an infectious agent that's trying to use you to replicate it, and damaging you and potentially killing you in the process. So, and it's also, this is a process that your body does many, many, many times. You meet infectious agents all the time. You get a cold, that is a coronavirus as well. Your body learns to defeat it. And so your body is doing this all the time. And it's not that different that it's coming into your body via a more controlled way. The tiger's in the cage, but I'm working that analogy. And, but so that's the choice. Like, this is something you're doing all the time anyway. It's not that big a deal in terms of you. And I think that's a really important thing to say. You're doing this anyway, and it's otherwise a very big risk. Right, questions, Carol. I have an allergy to penicillin. Does this mean I can't have the Pfizer vaccine?
So at this point in time, a penicillin allergy is not a contraindication for the Pfizer vaccine. I think most of the questions about allergies stem from, I think, there were reports at the beginning when it first was being implemented. There were specifically 2 healthcare workers in the UK who had anaphylactic reactions to the Pfizer vaccine. And since then, they've said that if you have had any past reactions to other vaccines, don't get these, but basically any other allergies are okay.
Could you actually do that? So there are some things which you shouldn't. So if you've got an allergy, there are some things you should. There are some allergies you shouldn't take the vaccine with.
So it's essentially, so they haven't published a conclusive report really about what caused those anaphylactic reactions. So they just say if you've had a reaction to a vaccine in the past, then don't get those vaccines. But
it's solely if you've a vaccine anaphylactic shock, not anything else. Because Kevin wrote on Facebook, I'm allergic to nuts, and remember seeing news that people with allergies were being told not to get the vaccine, with so much misinformation about, am I okay to get it? Yes, my younger sister is actually also allergic to nuts, but yes, there should not be any traces of nuts in these vaccines. if there are, then they're doing something severely wrong in the manufacturing. So yes, a nut allergy, peanut allergy is fine. But, yeah, I think it is it's the challenge of people trying to with matching the knowledge they've got with what they're learning so fast, and this deep dive that people are suddenly needing to take. And it's ever changing, right? There's basically new guidances like every single day as we continue to learn more and more. And so yeah, I know it's difficult to keep up. Now we're getting quite a few questions which are pretty sarcoidosis specific, and this session isn't for that, but we are doing some of those. So we'll be doing one in 1 to 2 weeks, another 3 to 4 weeks. So those will be happening, and we've already got the FAQ and our previous vaccine Q&A up, which should answer a good chunk of those. But those that have come in that we can't answer now, we will be keeping back and answering as soon as we can. I think something that is coming up a lot, though, which I think we can answer, is about immunosuppressed people, and because I think it's come up a lot. Are you happy to talk a little to that? Okay.
Sure, yeah. So obviously I'm not a medical doctor, so very specific drugs and interactions, like anything specific to you, you should obviously really consult your GP for. But big picture, I can talk about in general. If you're taking an immunosuppressant, it's currently fine to get these vaccines. Basically, what we think will happen is that if you're on an immunosuppressant, it's just likely that you might develop kind of a less immune response to the vaccine. So, there's kind of an expected antibody level that we would have in the general population. If you're on an immunosuppressant, that might be slightly lower, but we still envision that you'll have protection, some amount of protection from the vaccine. So from what I have seen, taking an immunosuppressant, you're still able to get the COVID-19 vaccines.
And I think that's a really good example of the difference between what people are thinking in the science. So when people are talking about immunosuppressants and the vaccine, they're going, oh my God, does that mean my body will allow me to catch it? And that's the exact reverse of that. So what it means, the vaccine, it does not contain live virus. There's zero chance of catching COVID from it. And it actually doesn't even contain the whole virus, right? That's a big part of the point of these modern ones. But because your immune system is reduced, what the evidence is currently saying is that your immune response, and therefore the antibodies you create, is less than that of other people. And so that unfortunately means that the protection you get may well also be less. And that's the thing that's worrying people about that at the moment. So they're not worried that you're going to catch COVID from the vaccine or that you're going to have any kind of larger problem from it. The thing they are worried about is that because your the immune system is less, that you won't then react and create the antibodies that are needed. So, and that actually is all the more reason, to my mind, and just is that more likely that you should take it, because you if you catch the tiger in the wild, I mean you're much more at risk. That's the big concern. Right, more questions. We've got lots coming in online. I think this question is a variant of the one that we've just done, but Michael sent in a message via our website, just saying, if the immune system is suppressed by steroids, how will it wake up and recognize the vaccine?
Yeah, so depending on the vaccine, so obviously if it's repressed by steroids, kind of similar mechanisms, that you'll still have some immunosuppression, right? But I guess in general, the way that we wake up your immune system is by the adjuvantation aspect of vaccines. So for RNA vaccines, they're considered to be self-adjuvanting. So they kind of wake up your immune system by their inherent properties, so we don't have to add anything else to them. And this really kind of big picture has evolved from, many of these viruses that infect us are RNA-based viruses, right? So actually, your immune system has evolved over time to recognize these foreign RNAs and know that you need to wake up and make an immune response to that. So that's kind of how they wake up your immune system. It's an inherent part of all of the cells in your body. But when you're on steroids or some sort of immunosuppressant, this is often just a weekend effect, really. So it still works, but you just might, as we said, make a lesser immune response.
Yeah, who knows? You might be getting more jabs, not less. That might be what's gonna happen. We'll find out. Ali via Facebook sent in I thought a really interesting question, and they said, I've heard that having an autoimmune condition will in itself reduce the efficacy of the vaccine, and is this true or why? And I think that's a very interesting different consideration about having an autoimmune condition. Do we have any understanding around that?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. So it's hard to say specifically for these vaccines as well, because in the clinical trial, which is where we have the most data so far, autoimmune patients aren't usually included in those clinical trials. So it's hard to make any sort of data-driven conclusion about that. I think in general, typically the reason that autoimmune patients would develop a lesser immune response is similar. It's that you're on usually immunosuppressive drugs, right? So I don't think it's the autoimmune disease itself. I think it's the interaction of the drugs that you would be taking. So kind of a similar question in that way.
Thank you. Paula sent in a question via Facebook. If we assumed to say have 50% protection, what does 50% mean? Does it work? Does it work for? I have to keep giving Paula points here because this is a very insightful question. Because does it mean it works for 50% of people, or does it mean 50% could be immune, or does it mean something else? And I think Paula's getting an A+ star for her statistical understanding.
Yes. Yes. So the answer is really none of the above. So the way that they calculate this efficacy for the clinical trial is that in the third phase of the clinical trial, when there are tens of thousands of participants, they have an arm of the clinical trial that's the placebo arm and the arm that gets the vaccine, right? So they both get injections, and then they follow them over time to see who actually gets COVID-19. So they record the frequency of cases in the placebo arm and the frequency of cases in the vaccine arm. And then they compare this basically risk reduction based off of getting this intervention, which is getting the vaccine. And so it's really your reduced risk when you get the vaccine versus the placebo. So it's basically just like a statistical based approach. It doesn't mean that 50% of people will be protected. I guess, when they report this data, they also present the number of people that seroconverted. So how many people made antibodies to the vaccine. And that's usually much, much higher, like over 90% or, nearing 100% of people that get the vaccine. So that's the breakdown of it. It doesn't mean that, 90% of people will be protected from ever getting it. It's really a risk reduction. And actually for the clinical trials, it's to severe disease. So just recently, I think yesterday in the Lancet, Oxford and AstraZeneca had like a preprint of the most, advanced data that we have on transmission actually, where they saw in their phase 3 trial that it actually also reduced transmission. So prior to this, all of the data that we've seen has just been shown to reduce the severity of disease. But now we have some indication that these higher antibody levels will also reduce transmission, which is really, really promising.
It is, and it's very, that was very important. And the Lancet also being something you recently had some comments published in. Just dropping that in there. The theme of the tests, and JP has asked on Facebook in the live stream if vaccine require updates for variants, are they going to need to go through the same trials?
Very good question, and everybody's kind of wondering this. So I will say that I think it will depend on where you are and the regulatory body that's approving these. Obviously, one of the real benefits of RNA vaccines is that we can make a new one so quickly, right? Which is really the reason why we were able to get, the first 2 approved vaccines were RNA vaccines. And so, that's great because it means if there is a new strain, we can easily just make those mutations, make a new vaccine. I think at this point, from what I've heard, there will be some requirement for doing a clinical trial. Obviously, you need to test it in some people and make sure that they're generating an immune response that's functional and neutralizes the new strain of the virus. But to put it into perspective, I don't think we're going to need to go through all 3 phases of clinical trial again. Because if you think about it, for flu, every year they approve a new vaccine without doing all of those clinical trials, right? So the reason that they can do this is specifically for flu, they have a correlate of protection. So this is just a fancy way of saying they have some, assay, some tests that they can do to know if the vaccine, is a good vaccine for the strains that are out there, and a test they can do without running all those clinical trials. So we don't yet have a correlate of protection for COVID-19. So we don't know, usually this would be like an antibody level in the blood that it needs to achieve to be able to approve it and say, it works equally as well as its predecessors. So we don't have that yet. I think as we get more and more data from these clinical trials, as well as following up these epidemiological studies, we'll kind of hone in on that. And so I think that will make the regulatory process faster. But I think short answer, I think we will need to continue to test them, but I don't think they'll need to go through all 3 phases.
Thank you. Do you know what they do with the flu vaccine? Because that gets new ones every year.
Yeah, so for the flu vaccine, the correlate of protection is called the HAI titer. So it's the hemagglutinin inhibition. And this is specifically how flu enters the cells and what you're trying to target. And so it's like a HAI titer of 40 is what qualifies it to be the new flu vaccine.
Thank you. I've had a really quite a sad question from Martin via the website. I've received my first vaccination shot. When can my daughter, who works in a nursery, reasonably move back in with me? I think we can assume Martin is shielding.
Oh, that's a tough one. So for now, as we don't have that much data on transmission and how much other people around you are protected, unfortunately, the guidance from the government is still that you need to continue adhering to all of the guidelines, which are wear a mask, maintain your physical distancing, and keep washing your hands. So at this point, nothing really changes when you get the vaccine. I think this will change at some point in time. It's hard to say, is it when everybody's gotten vaccinated, or is it when we have more data on what is actually safe to do? But the tough answer for now is that we have to maintain exactly what we're doing, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I've not been able to go see my parents, and I think a part of what they're looking for is to see the overall amount of COVID in the population going down. In the summer, the risk for everyone, and what allowed us to go and do more things was not that there'd been some great change in what we were doing. It was because with the summer there was less prevalence, so our chances of bumping into someone with COVID was relatively low, and that allowed us to be out. And then obviously that's changed again with the winter. And what they're looking to see is, I think, well, obviously we don't fully know, is that once that prevalence comes down, then that overall lowers the risk regardless, and we can then start to really change the rules. And we're planning to celebrate, we cancelled Christmas, we're planning to celebrate Vaximus. That's what we're looking forward to. I've said that we have to have presents. It's not any kind of muss without presents. We had a question from Helen, which I don't know if we know the answer to. How do we know that the vaccine will not overstimulate the T cells immune response in patients who have an autoimmune disease? I think we touched on that before, but I think the answer is you're able to talk to that.
I guess specifically for overstimulation of T cells, with the vaccine and RNA vaccines specifically, it doesn't target just T cells, right? So actually, kind of the main immunity that we're driving from it is from B cells. So for those that aren't familiar, so B cells are your humoral immunity. So this is producing antibodies against a virus, whereas T cells function to actually kill an infected cell. So I guess when people worry about the overstimulation of T cells for autoimmune diseases, it's not like you can, yes, get that occasionally from some viral infections, but you shouldn't have the same effect from RNA vaccines specifically, because we're really targeting the humoral immunity with those. Not to say that, it's not a possibility, but I guess in the populations that have gotten it so far, it hasn't been reported as a side effect or an outcome. So, I guess I'm sure we'll get more data on this in the future as well.
Thank you. Elizabeth, I have cardiac sarcoidosis. I'm getting my vaccine on Sunday, thank goodness, she says. Gina said, I've had my vaccine today. I just felt a bit sleepy. Feel okay now. I have a sarcoid of the lungs, lymph, medium, and in chests and joints. AJ, I had the Pfizer jab on the first and woke up with a headache. I slept a bit in the afternoon. Still feeling a bit weak and shaky, but okay. So, so everyone's doing it. I think my father, he only complained of a sore arm and said he was a bit sleepy. But honestly, like, if there's an excuse for a nap, that man's taking it. So we have to take that.
Sorry, I was just going to say the other thing to keep in mind is that the side effects can be kind of concerning, but actually from an immunologist perspective, this is usually a good sign for us, because it means that you're generating some sort of immune response to the vaccine. So it's kind of counterintuitive that the side effects are a good thing, but really from an immune response perspective, they are.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Actually, there's something to go, this is good. This means something is happening and it's working. And which isn't to mean if you don't get any that's a bad thing. That's also fine. Potentially your mum has been writing in under the name of Natalie. Are there any considerations to make if planning a future pregnancy, considering the new technology of these vaccines?
Yeah, so this is, a particularly sensitive subject always for pregnant women and doing clinical trials, just because they are such a, more vulnerable population. So the recommendation as of now in the UK that I have seen is that the guidance is that you don't get pregnant for 2 months after getting the vaccine, and that if you are currently pregnant, to consult with your GP depending on your clinical risk of getting the virus and any other safety precautions that there may be. But something that's really interesting. So kind of other than that, there aren't restrictions. So there shouldn't be any downstream effects. And if you were recently had a child, it should be okay as well. The really interesting thing is that often vaccines aren't tested in pregnant women, but actually I know specifically Moderna is now doing a clinical trial that includes pregnant women as well as pediatrics, so children. So they are starting to look at testing these vaccines in these more vulnerable populations, and I think that's great because it's so much better to be able to have really good data on how it affects certain populations as opposed to just, basing it off of after we've given it to them. So it's great that they're starting to incorporate those trials.
And it absolutely is. And but in terms of to make sure we cover it, the idea that there's any kind of long-term impact and long-term issue on someone's ability to be pregnant and to give birth to a healthy child, could you talk to that?
So as far as like the long-term effects of the vaccine?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, the really honest answer, and that everybody always points out, right, is that if we only made this vaccine like 10 months ago, how can we know the long-term side effects of it? And that's absolutely true. Obviously, we don't have data specific for these vaccines, but, we continue to follow people out from the clinical trials for years after they get it. So we will eventually have it specifically for these vaccines. But as scientists, we know that since this is a platform, right, this, RNA vaccines, even ChAdOx, the Oxford and AstraZeneca vaccines, have been used previously for other indications, right? So they're largely the same formulation, but just for different diseases. And so there is a lot of clinical data for both of these. Actually, something I think people don't realize is that the first RNA vaccine trial was done in 2013. So we do actually have, years of safety data from those patients now, and there's no reason to expect that we would have any different long-term effects from, these very similar vaccines. But of course, we don't know yet. I think the thing to consider is, the real risk is what are the long-term effects of getting COVID-19, right? So I think that is much more unknown because it's a brand new virus. Sure, it's similar to some other coronaviruses, but there's already symptoms that we haven't seen before, like, losing your taste and smell, which is actually quite prevalent and indicative that it is changing those cells and tissues somehow. And so, yeah, that's kind of, how I look at the long-term risks and what you need to take into consideration.
Thank you so much. Now I know we've come to the end of our time with you. And, I've learned an enormous amount. I've valued it a huge amount. You've answered a lot of questions, and thank you. And you've dealt with my tiger analogy with true professionalism. And no, you've been fantastic. Do you have any wrap-up words that you'd like to say? Oh, I think. Oh, yeah, no, it froze. We're back.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think we covered a lot today. In general, yeah, I guess what I always say is that, I think it's actually really good that people are skeptical about vaccines and what they're putting into their body. I think it's great to be asking questions. But I really just urge everybody to consult really, scientific sources and good sources of data to educate yourself and make a really good decision for yourself about whether to get a vaccine. So that's kind of my final remark. But also, yeah, thanks so much for having me today. It was a pleasure.
We've loved it. It's been very important and very valuable, and we've had a lot of comments coming in of people saying thank you and how much they've appreciated it. So thank you enormously. I have one last question, but I think everyone needs to know this. When it comes up, I will take whatever vaccine they give me. And what's your answer to that as well?
Absolutely. I just saw a thing the other day that my expected vaccination schedule is in August or September of this year in British Columbia. So it might be a while, but hopefully more vaccines become available before then and that gets, sped up.
Fantastic. Thank you very much again. And thank you everyone for watching. I have to do the plug, which is, we're a small charity trying to do the most we can. If you're able to donate, that is very important to us too. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Anna. And thank you everyone, and goodbye. Thank you so much, Anna. It's been absolutely wonderful.
Bye everyone.